It's really great to be here with you all today. Show of hands, how many of you are private landowners? Okay. How many of you are agency or restoration practitioners? Okay. Any kind of cohorts of people I'm missing? Any nonprofits? Okay, you got some mid-coast this year. All right, just wanted to get a sense for who the audience was. At the entrance on that circular table, there was the sign-in sheet. There was also a assessment, just one page. And so there are two questions kind of before the talk, and then the rest of the questions are for after the talk. And this is for me as OSU Extension to be able to have feedback from you all and to improve my educational program. So I'm really glad to be here with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and also with uh, the U.S. Forest Service to talk to you all about prescribed fire here on the Oregon coast. We did also invite the Nature Conservancy as well as the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. Unfortunately, neither were able to join us as well, but they are definitely partners to consider with regards to prescribed fire here on the Oregon coast. So I'm Aaron Groth. I'm a regional fire specialist for the coast with OSU Extension Service Fire Program, and I serve Lincoln County. So some of our objectives today, increase understanding of the role of prescribed fire in maintaining coastal meadow habitat at the landscape scale. And this is really a long-term goal. This isn't going to be accomplished overnight, but increase support and planning by MidCoast Watersheds Council board and staff, private landowners, and partner agencies and organizations for application of prescribed fire on private lands. We're also going to talk some of the constraints and barriers, both biophysical as well as socioeconomic and political to application of prescribed fire. And then I also want to highlight the potential. This isn't to say that it is the solution, but I want to present it as a potential option. Prescribed burn association for the mid-coast and or north coast. So outline, indigenous or cultural fire, ecological effects of fire, succession and loss of habitat, barriers and constraints, and prescribed burn associations. So goals of indigenous or cultural burning can include increasing the vigor and abundance of species, including foodstuffs, creating habitat for wildlife, easing travel along important trails, aiding in ceremonial purposes. So here's a map of the North Coast in terms of the tribes that are present. The recognized tribe of Lincoln County being the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. I included this picture of the Alsea woman digging for roots in Siosla National Forest because I'm hoping to encounter primary sources with regards to indigenous land use here on the coast, particularly with regards to fire. But that's going to require long-term historical society relationship building with tribes. Also, very importantly, Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians have just regained their hunting, gathering, and fishing rights for off-reservation lands. Very important development. So here is historic prairie vegetation of Lincoln County based on General Land Office survey data from 1855 to 1910. So it's the areas that are in pink. So Cascade Head would be right about here. Just north of Waldport, or don't see it because of the zoom there. Sorry. I'll move on. I'll move on, but there are more prairies that are going south along the coast there. There's been tremendous landscape transformation. Fire had been used by indigenous people for thousands of years to manage lands, and local plants and animals evolved and adapted to this frequent disturbance. Later, the suspension of this cultural practice led to the loss of fire resilient plants, animals, and the ecological services that they provide. So based on the general land office data that's in a data set, I created this table to show on the coast, there were 285, according to the survey data, there were 285 coastal prairies totaling almost 61,000 acres. Here in Lincoln County, there were a total of 37 prairies totaling almost 9,300 acres. And then I have a series of photographs, kind of repeat photography, showing how greatly landscapes have changed and transformed here on the Oregon coast. So here on the Coast Range, coastal bluff and montane grasslands are dominated by low-growing vegetation such as bunch grasses, forbs, mosses, and dwarf shrubs. They occur within a matrix of conifer forest. Outer coastal bluffs and headlands are influenced by wind and salt spray, which limit the growth of woody vegetation. Montane grasslands include dry meadows and balds that occur on dry, south-facing slopes with shallow, sandy, or gravelly soils. They're primarily influenced by periodic fire, soil upheaval by rodents, and drought conditions. So, as I said, this is Yachats looking north. You can see a fairly large extent of grassland. You've obviously had urban development that has occurred along the Oregon coast, but you've also had woody plant encroachment. You've had the development of forests that within this area. You can see there is some woody vegetation here, but there's an even greater extent of woody vegetation currently. This is the Cape Perpetua overlook. So you can see even in 1933, time of the Civilian Conservation Corps, US Highway 101, and grassland on either side of that. And then you can see encroachment by conifers occurring in the present. Heceta Head. So this is 1898. You can see not much in the way of trees. And then in 1950, you have an increase in cover of trees. Then today, if you were to drive through this landscape, it would, appear to be closed canopy forest. I didn't include photos. I wanted to focus on the coastal grasslands and coastal meadows, but it is worth mentioning that there's also the Bureau of Land Management's Lost Prairie Area of Critical Environmental Concern. I'd like to do some more investigation in terms of fire in that landscape. And then also the U.S. Forest Service at the Oregon National Dunes. They conduct prescribed fire for snowy plover and also to reduce the cover of European beach grass and also allow for native beach grasses. So fire's ecological role, reinitiate young or early cereal vegetation, create gaps for biodiversity, reduce buildup of surface fuels, recycle nutrients, regenerate plants, stimulate biological diversity among plant species and habitats. Cascade Head, there's been prescribed fire occurring in this landscape. Well, since dispossession of Indigenous people in the 1980s, the Nature Conservancy began conducting prescribed burns in this area. But you can see this is the Brubeck year aerial survey, and you have a large area of coastal meadow right there. And in 2018, conducting a prescribed burn. The life history of the Oregon silver spot butterfly revolves around its obligatory host plant, early blue violet. David Thompson of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is going to follow up with the next presentation. He's going to talk about this in greater detail. But evidence suggests that the habitat this plant relies upon was much more extensive than it is today in the past. Its habitat has steadily been used for residential and business establishments, public parkland development, parking areas, or lawns. Secondary impact of people's activities include introduction of exotic species, as well as fire suppression. And the succession of meadows to brush and stunted woodland have also contributed to a reduction in suitable habitat. Conserving and enhancing populations of rare species. Fire suppression has reduced habitats, which threatens many rare plants. Grasslands, meadows, and open forest are particularly important for rare plants in several parts of the state. Coastal prairie habitat on which the Oregon silverspot butterfly is dependent will quickly become scrub, brush, or forest if left unmanaged. This is woody plant encroachment. Natural processes such as wildfires and wildlife grazing likely function to maintain open grasslands in the past. Today, this habitat must be actively managed to maintain a grassland structure. So mowing, burning, and the planting of native plants are among the current habitat management strategies. Here's Nestucca National Wildlife Refuge, Forest Service and Fish and Wildlife Service conducting a prescribed burn. David's actually going to have a case study and a lot more information on prescribed fire at this site. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about the barriers and constraints. Landslides can limit access. So in order to conduct a prescribed burn, you might need to have resources in place like fire engines. And so there's recently been a landslide at Cascade Head, which I know the past couple of years has limited the ability of the Nature Conservancy to conduct burns there. Fuels and weather can also be really important barriers. So temperatures, humidity, and also the moisture content of the vegetation, as well as wind direction and speed, are also influencing the ability to have prescribed fire. And then from a regulatory perspective, particularly on private lands, forestry as well as local fire plays a key role. And then also smoke, concerns about escape, and trust. With regards to smoke, smoke can impact vulnerable populations. The smoke from prescribed fire is less than from wildfires. The Department of Environmental Quality regulates smoke from prescribed fires. Concerns about escape. Escapes can happen, although they are rare. Everybody remembers Hermit's Creek in New Mexico, but really prescribed fire is a very effective land management tool. It is over 99.5% effective or even higher. There are precautions that are taken as part of a burn plan. This can include digging fire line, having water available on site, and then also local fire, Oregon Department of Forestry, or other federal agency suppression resources standing by. Trust. Tribes, agencies, and organizations, as well as private landowners, need social license to burn. These entities highlight prescribed fire before, during, and after the burn through media, usually. And then also responsiveness to questions and concerns, be they from elected leaders or from the general public. So I don't know that for MidCoast and or the North Coast that a prescribed burn association is necessarily the best solution or answer, but I think it's important to inform you all what a prescribed burn association is. It's a community-based network of individuals and organizations who cooperate to implement prescribed burns on private lands. Nationally, 135 prescribed burn associations conduct thousands of burns over hundreds of thousands of acres of land annually. And there are great benefits to this. It's low cost. There's technical support provided for landowners. Landowners are working together to build capacity, often with local fire departments and other agency partners. There's experiential learning that's accessible to all, and it can be meaningful and fun. So here's existing prescribed burn associations in Oregon as well as Southwest Washington. There is the Rogue Valley Prescribed Burn Association serving Jackson and Josephine counties. There's the Umpqua Prescribed Burn Association. And then there's the recently formed South Willamette Valley Prescribed Burn Association. And that's being developed by agency practitioners, including ODF's state coordinator for prescribed fire, Amanda Rao. There was recently the Oak and Prairie Summit in Salem. And at that event, we had over 30 landowners and agency practitioners who were interested in starting a mid and or northern Willamette Valley Prescribed Burn Association. And then Mount Adams Resource Stewards has a Mount Adams Prescribed Burn Association that they've been fostering as well. There's a potential for cross-boundary fire. Fire knows no property boundaries. So I know that Mount Adams Resource Stewards and their trust lands have done cross-boundary burning with the National Wildlife Refuge System, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The U.S. Forest Service also has the Wyden Authority that in other areas of the United States West has been used for the U.S. Forest Service conducting burns on federal property, but then also with consenting adjacent private property owners as well. So conclusion, fire has always played a role on the Oregon coast. And in fire's absence, there has been a notable decline in meadows habitat. Fire may be a key management tool for meadows restoration on the coast. Many barriers and constraints can be overcome with planning, permitting, as well as development of and adherence to the burn plan. A PBA may serve the needs of the mid-coast and or north coast private landowners, agencies, and organizations. And so in closing, before I hand it off to David, I have some calls to action for you all. Locate sites that might benefit from prescribed fire. Talk to your neighbors, both private landowners as well as public agencies. Pursue training, prescribed fire basics. The OSU Extension Fire Team has a series of 12 prescribed fire basics. 11 of them are on the back wall there and the OSU Extension table. Feel free to grab a copy. I brought many copies, so please take them. Ignite prescribed fire trainings, the new certified burn manager course, the National Wildfire Coordinating Group, NWCG courses, and then also prescribed fire training exchanges. Mount Adams Stewards and Mount Adams Prescribed Burn Association recently hosted a treks in Southwest Washington. And then network to form a mid-coast and or north coast prescribed burn association that include landowners and many agencies and organizations. And also importantly, many volunteer fire departments across the Oregon coast are always seeking volunteers. And in the case of Rogue Valley Prescribed Burn Association, the local fire departments have contributed to supporting prescribed burning by private landowners, and they have also had members of those PBAs become volunteer firefighters for those local fire departments. So with that, I'll hand it off to David Thompson. Thank you all so much.
I'm a restoration specialist that was hired by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and U.S. Forest Service. It's in a shared position. It also includes ecological services and the refuge system to focus entirely on coastal meadow management in support of the recovery of the Oregon silver spot. So it's a very focused position, and it kind of leads into this title. If you're like me, you know the phrase, but you might not know exactly what it means vaguely. So I had to look it up. It's to be unable to understand a situation or problem because you are too focused on the details. And that idiom is very relevant, literally and figuratively, in what I do. It's important for you to understand the context of my work because the needs of this species guides a lot of the decisions I make and the choices we make for habitat management are directly related to how we understand what this species requires in coastal meadows. I will refer to them occasionally as OSB out of habit, and sometimes just say silver spot, just so that no one's confused, but speaking of confusion, this conceptual figure attempts to depict the life history of the Oregon silver spot. We just need to understand which life stages were present at which time and how what we do affects what species, how we could, impact the species depending on where they are. Sorry, the font is a little small. So it wasn't for you to read all of the details. It was more to see that the Oregon silver spot's life history it starts in June when the females start laying eggs, because that's when new generation starts. And so we look at their year as June to July because that's how their life history works. And when you do things influences certain life stages and when you can do things. So the critical habitat features for the silver spotters, as Aaron said, the host plant for the larva, what they eat, is the early blue violet. And they only eat violets. So they have to be present and they have to be in certain densities in order to be suitable habitat for the larvae and allow them to grow up to become butterflies. And then, of course, the adults need a certain amount of diverse and abundant nectar resources or open flowers during their flight season so they can continue to feed while they carry their reproduction. And the early blue violet is going to be most abundant, as Aaron said already, when the grassland community is youngest. So you need a disturbance to happen. And, without humans, that could be just a wildfire that happens, or an earthquake, or other species, ground, moles and whatnot, disturbing the soil, opening up gaps in the community can create a place for a violet, which is going to thrive in their space. But as soon as the dominant species come in and start to take the space, they'll crowd out the violets. The violets are not the dominant species, but they can do quite well in their space. And so you need that early succession. And the take-home message of that is that some wildlife depend on its habitat being routinely disturbed. And that's, I think, something that is not necessarily clear to everyone. It wasn't clear to me when I was a young biologist that usually we're told to leave no trace, right? It's a wilderness, walk softly, don't make a mess. And then someone comes in and tells me, we got to burn this whole place. And you're like, wait, what's nature? You leave it alone. These humans, we're not always a bad influence. So, so the Oregon silver spot butterfly requires young meadows in order for that host plant to be abundant and feed the larvae. How are those habitat doing? As Aaron mentioned earlier, not well. And the Oregon Conservation Strategy cites that less than 1% of coastal meadows remaining from their extent a century ago. That's a really grim statistic. Our own spatial analyst in the Oregon office has been exploring this, looking at habitat changes in the coastal zone. And this is one of his maps that shows the historical and current extent of what's called non-forested. It's a mapping type that was very commonly used in older data sets. It doesn't mean that all of that color shown in historical was meadow. It just means it wasn't forest. It might be shrubland. If we use an Institute for Natural Resources data set, probably about 10% of that or less was actually meadow in the non-forested type. But the important point, and what was been alluded to by us, is the Northwest Forest Plan says this, our own forest specialists in ecological services, that forest has actually done quite well as a habitat type over the last century. Yes, we need to conserve more historic forests, old forests, yes, but in overall, other habitat types have lost out to forest because we have not been engaged in managing the habitats as the tribes were doing. So his analysis showed that about 2/3 of the non-forested habitats have been converted to forest. Only about 5% was lost to development. You know, our cities, I'm sorry, our towns and villages. And that includes agricultural uses. Only 5% has been changed to, a human use. So really it's 2/3 has changed from meadow into forest. And that's because we're not engaged actively in managing the landscape as humans once were. And I've already answered my next question. Sorry, but if you're interested in that history, Aaron mentioned a lot of it already, but Charles Mann a few decades ago wrote this book, 1491, which is a compendium of archaeological evidence in the Americas, both North and South, prior to Columbus. And he was inspired by his son's high school history book, which he found atrocious. And it's a really great read. I highly recommend it. This map that I put up here is from the book, and he admits it's an incomplete map of indigenous land management practices in the Americas. But you can see it's quite extensive. And he notes in the unlegible footnotes at the bottom that human use of fire played an important role in the ecology of the entire hemisphere. So not just the "you are here" spot where we are currently, which is showing fire use, but throughout the both continents. Some specific examples that I've heard in the past, working with the UC Santa Cruz archaeologists, he said there was 5,000 years of evidence in the archaeological record in their digs of anthropogenic fire use for routine management of the coast. Even in California, where it's drier and you think it would be so aggressive, but fire is an important role. State parks down there uses it to manage sensitive salamander and frog habitat, because if they don't manage it, it will become shrubland and it will no longer be salamander and frog habitat. Aaron mentioned Cascade Head earlier. The TNC folks told me that the tribes in the Cascade Head region used to light Cascade Head up annually to welcome the salmon home as part of their tradition to celebrate the salmon returning by lighting Cascade Head on fire for other reasons, not just because they wanted to have a night party. There's other reasons for doing prescribed fire tribes. And then I should also cite that the Northwest Forest Plan's own 2018 science census, which hopefully is feeding into that amendment process, says a lot about the lack of land management, especially prescribed fire, for managing meadows within the Pacific Northwest. And so if you don't want to search that 1,000-page tome yourself, you can start on page 860. It has a lot about indigenous practices. I love being able to search a document, reading 1,000 pages. And just to drive this home, maybe this crowd is not so shocked by the idea that humans could have a positive influence on the landscape. But that Charles Mann book quotes a University of Pennsylvania archaeologist named Erickson, who referred to the built environment, the human built environment, applies to most, if not all, neotropical landscapes. And so that would include the Amazon basin. And this book goes into detail about how the tribes of the Amazon basin were managing the forests for their own uses. And so as we see that as a natural paradise, perhaps, we can reconsider our own value to the landscape. So, as we already said, we have learned the unintended consequences of Europeans removing fire from the landscape. They've been quite severe. Increasing fuel loads have led to catastrophic wildfires and the losses of habitats that conversions of meadows to forests. And we're shifting away from this paradigm, but it'll take time, and we need the will to continue through with empowering our fire teams to get us out of the mess that we've made over the last few centuries. But I said earlier that it's quite a it's the situation for the coastal meadows is quite bad because of the extent remaining. Less than 1% or even a third would be terrible. And the species that rely on those meadows are having a very hard time. And so the agencies, state agencies, federal agencies, NGOs, everyone is all very busy trying to do as much as we can in these intensive care units, I call them, these very small habitats, less than 100 acres at a time, trying to conserve these species that really need hundreds of thousands of acres to thrive. And this is one of those sites. So this is the Nesucca Bay National Wildlife Refuge, just north of Lincoln City, a little above Nesquin. Very great place to go take a walk. Some beautiful trails. The prairie in the spring and the summer is gorgeous. They've done a great job. So the staff of the refuge, this refuge was first established to conserve habitat for migratory geese and some sensitive species of geese. So there's a lot of bottomland or floodplain habitat that's managed for sensitive waterfowl. But the refuge, when it was acquired, included this hillside and these forests, and on the hill was an old dairy. And the staff of the refuge found some remnant native prairie in amongst the pasture grasses of the dairy farm area. And so they said let's restore native prairie. It's a rare, coastal habitat type. And then we could, reintroduce or introduce the organs of the spot butterfly to, create a new population because the refuge can commit to long-term management. Yeah, so the refuge was established in 1993. This wasn't found until maybe 2010 or maybe a little earlier. And work on the prairie didn't start till around 2011. You can see you might be able to notice here, there's some different colors. Some mowing had occurred in large parts of the prairies. We've done a lot of work on that. Still to this day, is mowing a suitable management technique for resetting grasslands. And we found it to have, fairly limited utility for various reasons. We use it in some cases, but in general, it doesn't seem to have as much utility as prescribed fire for resetting communities. In this image, these are just a series of historic satellite images that happen to show great events. Get lucky, and you can find the right set. So this is 2016, and it was right after they were successful in burning a large. So this was a prescribed fire. You can see it from the image. But why I'm also showing this one is that this burn was actually first attempted in 2015, and it didn't work. And they did it in 2016 and it worked. And the point there is that, as we've said before, fire risks are quite low on the coast because of the fuels, have a lot of moisture in them. Burn teams generally like humidities in the air to be below 60% so that they can, use drip torches to start a fire propagating through the landscape. That doesn't really work on the coast because our humidities are usually above 80%. So it's much more difficult. So the primary tool they've settled on now is called the Terra Torch, which is similar to a military flamethrower. It's kind of a shocking piece of equipment. These are professionals. A lot of people here. There's not just the two guys and the one truck. It's a lot of people. Dan and his whole team. This is a Siuslaw Fire Zone team working at Nesucca just this year. And there's quite a group there, and this has allowed them to overcome some of the issues of using prescribed fire. We'll get into a little bit more of that. So this is the way I feel sometimes about this whole thing, is that don't forget earlier that I said that the silver spot's going to rely on routine management, which means perpetual management. You can't just and then I'm going to restore this area, then we can walk away and it can be great for nature to do its thing. We have to stay engaged and be actively involved. And so how does that play on a restoration site? It's the case study. Back to Nestucca. This map, the map on the right shows the management areas, and the green areas show the burns that were done in 2021. How do we get to that? Why are we doing those areas? Refuge staff, especially Kate and myself, would look at the data from previous years, including the violet mapping, which is that map in the center. That's something we do annually, and we use that map to identify suitable habitat for the larvae, the caterpillars of the organ-sellers butterfly. And then we're out on the site looking at the state of the vegetation. Is this too tall? Is it getting overgrown? Is it starting to go through succession, get older? Does it need to be reset? There's not a lot of violets left here anymore. Let's reset this area. And so we'll pick areas, and we have a limit of suitable habitat that will impact in a given year to make sure we don't impact that species too much while we're managing it. But you have to, you're right in the same place as this listed species. So we have guidelines that we use. In this case, it's less than 25% of suitable habitat can be impacted in a given year. And that allows us to pick the marginal areas that are near, and there'll be some suitable, or not a large part of it. And this is just a picture from the 2021 burn. You'll see that the vegetation looks quite nice. That's because this was a spring burn. And there's a problem with prescribed fire in that a lot of the, most of the work occurs in the fall. And if the wildfire season is bad and the wildfire suppression work continues into the fall, they have to start canceling fire prescriptions because they're busy putting out fires. And so one of the ways around that is what they're called, used to be called cool season burns or spring burns. And of course, it's much more difficult because the vegetation is not dry. It's even wetter because it's the Oregon coast spring. And it looks like this. And so one of the ideas for a way to approach this is to visit the site twice. Once to come out and burn it just to kill off the vegetation and dry it out. And then they'd return a second time to consume it. It's double the work, but if you're facing the uncertainty or you just wanted to do a burn last fall, you couldn't do it, they were busy with wildfire suppression, and you come back in the spring and do this, probably they might have more time. So it's one of the techniques for something you might see if this becomes more common, that there be burns in the spring. And obviously it's much less risky because everything around you is nuclear. So in 2022, if you remember, sorry, that was a long time between slides. So you see the green polygons and the blue polygons, different areas. And there's also some very colorful bars that are associated with this. That is a research project on the Oregon Silver butterfly that included habitat management techniques in the experimental design. But these were the burns that were done in 2022. And this was a fall burn, you can see by the vegetation. Those, a lot of people holding that fire line. This was a successful burn. And then in 2023, if I remember correctly, the wildfire season did extend late. And there wasn't as many resources able to do this prescribed burn, and they were only able to attempt one of the units in 2023. I didn't have a picture of that, so you just get to see a pretty picture. If you come out in the spring, this is what you'll see. This used to be all pasture grasses, dairy cattle. So I think the refuge has done an excellent job in converting this habitat and this area into usable habitat for native plants. So we finished up the 2023 fire prescription in 24, just this year. And you already saw the little animation of the territory in action that was for this year. So just to go back to that very messy map, the actions map in the beginning, you can see how we we just sort of move around and piece together a rotational fire prescription management to manage the whole site so that some parts of it are in really good conditions, some are in marginal, some are in poor, and we're working. And that's kind of how the management is set up, and it helps us reach these goal areas that I did mention earlier. Different colors of mid-cereal for nectar habitat and early cereal for larval habitat that we picked up based on how the habitat behaves. So I kind of stressed. I'm gonna harp on it. Is that I should probably revise this to say that humanity needs to be a positive influence on our wildlands because it's obvious that the wildlands need us. Humans have been a part of the ecology of the Americas for thousands of years, and we changed that. And now we're slowly going back to being an active member of the ecology of our areas. Yeah. I think I'll stop there.
So I'm gonna invite all of our panelists and speakers to come back up here. If you haven't spoken yet, I'd encourage you to introduce yourself and we're gonna do a little Q&A session.
Hey, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Kayla Quinto. I'm a project leader at the Oregon Coast Refuge Complex, just a fancy word for refuge manager. So I've been involved at Mistaka Bay for the last 3 years.
Hello, I'm Dan Kroll. I'm the fire management officer on the Siuslaw National Forest. By position, I've been there since August of this year. I'm a prescribed fire burn boss by qualification, and I've worked for the Forest Service for 27 years in wildfire and prescribed fire throughout the West, the South, and the East Coast.
He's our real fire experience on the pitch. So what if people have questions?
I saw smoke today down towards wildfire. In the burn there.
That was not on Forest Service property. I'm not sure where it was. It looked like a pile from the look of the smoke to me. So state or private, I would think.
You know, there's a lot of apps that you can get that will tell you, like if there's a wildfire, like last year there was a little one in Toledo, you know, these things pop up all the time here. It's kind of, you search in your app thing on your phone, you'll find a variety of different apps that will tell you what's going on. I know people always have questions about smoke and I'm from the East Coast. When we first moved here, we're like, there's smoke everywhere, what's happening? What? Yeah, settling is more a normal part of living in Oregon, so I would highly recommend, you know, one of those apps to be able to check that out. Right there.
How much research has been done using dual applications, say power lines that are cleared every year, are there things that can be done when people come through? Can people come through and plans are rated by various agencies that have done so?
You're talking about right of way and.
No,
Yeah.
things that are the town property and
Mhm.
looking to see if it's possible, because they come through and clear it, I have to know these neighbors, so if it's come through, they're very skilled. But I would like to see if something could be done to explore that open area that times for spots. Even longer stretches of planting along
So,
the coast.
so I don't know what Bonneville will do, but other agencies like Forest Service, Refuges, probably BLM would come back through. Those corridors are very popular with pollinators because of the wind shelter.
Yeah.
Seem to just want to use those. And so the agencies that are interested will come through and plant or seed, nectar resources so that those can be of value. You could talk to Bonneville to see if they're interested, or if there's another agency
They have-
involved.
The process of getting in touch with them too. But I was wondering if any other people I worked with parts or just wonder how much more is coming along as we.
I don't know exactly what MidCoast is interested in doing in terms of private lands, restoration, but to me, that sounds like, that sounds more suited towards a nonprofit that might be looking to improve habitats where it's available. And like, you're right, if this area is being cleared regularly anyway for the power lines, then why not make it beneficial to wildlife? And so I'm sure if you can't find someone that will work with you on it, you can certainly find resources to help you to decide what to plant and that sort of thing. But unfortunately not our agencies.
I just was hoping that your interagency stuff, who has applicable information that you can, you already over here.
Yeah, even partners. So the Fish and Wildlife Service has a program called the Partners.
Sorry, can you go talk into the microphone?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sorry, I'm here at my, Fish and Wildlife Service has a Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, and they do projects that support wildlife on non-Fish and Wildlife Service lands. And so, I could give you a contact person to at least ask. They do a whole variety of different work. But if they can't do something, they can maybe point you in the right direction. For where you might be able to get funding or resources, yeah.
I'll preface by saying, that gel oleum flame for like. And I heard you both mention that Indigenous folks have been burning on the coast for years. Like why? I guess they obviously didn't have a gel oleum flame. Why would we use a gel petroleum flamethrower? Like petroleum is not good for animals, and so we reconcile that. This, endangered species, so let's just shoot some gasoline on it.
Yeah, so the intent,
Microphone.
Thank you.
the intent behind using the TerraTorch versus other more natural flame sources, or even the basic equivalent or alternative would be a drip torch that just has regular petroleum, which I know still has issues, right, but less intrusive. The reason that we choose to go with the TerraTorch is trying to make use of the available burn windows. So we have limited areas or windows of time where we can get in there to burn. And especially with it being super wet on the coast, it might be the difference between burning and not burning. And then when we do go to burn, we have a budget that we're working out of. So even for us, with the environmental issues aside, which I'm not discounting, I'm just saying there's a financial benefit to not using that TerraTorch, but it's trying to make that burn window work and possibly being the difference between getting to burn and not getting to burn. Does that make sense?
I mean, it just adds that. It's basically super constricted. Like we're already under there's lots of there's lots of forces trying to stop us from making this happen. Whereas when tribes for cultural burning, if, I don't know, if say it was a rainy year, maybe they didn't burn, but they could burn when it was appropriate for them and when it was appropriate in the environment. We don't always have the option to burn when it's appropriate. But you know, this is an artificial, it's an artificial application, right? Whereas when the tribes were doing it culturally, they were doing it, you know, when it was the right time. We don't have that luxury. We're also trying to recreate habitat in this 35-acre area, you know, that may or may not have had, it had meadow there because we found violets there, right? But it may or may not, you know, be the best place for Oregon silver-spot butterfly, but it's a national wildlife refuge and it's permanently protected, and we can try to make it the best place that it can be. So there's a lot of artificial things about it, and there's a lot of constraints that we're trying to work within to still make it work, including the biological opinion. You can't burn like that picture. It's important to point out a picture from 2016 where the whole prairie, the whole 35 acres was burned. That was before we started putting larval butterflies onto the landscape. So there were no listed butterflies there, and we could burn the whole thing. Once the listed butterflies are there, they're protected. We wouldn't want to burn the whole thing because we could kill them. So this is, you know, us working in a fishbowl. It's like a very, it has to be in this place at this time. You know, we have the money and the people that can be there tomorrow. And so the Terra Torch is a tool. It's also gives us, it's really actually a pretty good way to be very specific in like the areas that you burn. And in a perfect, if we were managing this stuff out really, really well, we've been doing it for years, and we had like, the goal is, long-term goal is like get a rotation. Is like you burn this area, then you burn this area, then you burn this area. You don't burn like these tiny little weird slivers, but because we're still learning and we're still trying things and we're even still trying to figure out how we measure where our best habitat is. And so lots of different factors go into it. And the Terra Torch, I believe that all of that material burns off. It doesn't
It's
leave,
all consumed.
right? It doesn't leave fuel and gel in the environment. And it allows us to get a higher consumption. I mean, you can walk through there right after the burn, and there, you know, there is no, you smell the burn, you don't smell the fuel. And it allows us to get the level of consumption that we're trying to get to set back the vegetation.
I have a question for Erin. The photos you were showing of the historical photos that showed the greater extent of grassland. I'm just wondering, is there any way with those photos to distinguish between areas that were actually historically prairie versus areas that may have been logged for their grassland?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would need, ideally, when you're looking at that land use, land cover change, you'd have multiple data points. So ideally, you know, we might have photos from the 1880s, the 1930s, 1960s, and the present, but usually you want to have like maybe 3 to 5 kind of data sets. So I would basically, my short answer would be I would have to look. But the general land office, in terms of the data that they were collecting from the 1850s through the early 1900s, those land surveyors would have noted if it was recently logged, but in their notes, they're indicating that it is prairie grassland habitat. But yeah, I would need to look more into those specific sites of Yahats, Yasita Head, and Cape Perpetua with regards to logging. But I believe that they are reflecting a meadow landscape.
Sharon. About the prescribed burning associations that you were mentioning at the beginning, Erin, are those involved with like wildfire production, like what do they do there?
Yeah, basically it takes an interested local party and then searching out the support. There's different kinds of administrative or management styles that have been attempted with prescribed burn association. For instance, in the case of the Rogue Valley Prescribed Burn Association, Aaron Krikova is the founder of it. He is a wildland firefighting contractor. He does have an organization with whom he works. He's able to have some billable hours in terms of, meetings or other aspects. But then in the case of Mount Adams Prescribed Burn Association, they literally have a burn boss like on staff writing burn plans for private landowners. So I would say that if there's an interest, it's having meetings and talking to people, finding who those landowners are. And then it can really be burning on a half acre of land or 1 acre of land, and you have the support, and you've gone through all the steps of, you're either burning not in the fire season and you don't really need to worry about much, but then you also have the ability to have local fire departments, Oregon Department of Forestry, or other agencies. In the case of Northeast Oregon, my colleague Micah Schmidt is the regional fire specialist for Northeast Oregon. There's actually retired U.S. Forest Service burn bosses who are interested in contributing to a prescribed burn association. So I think that it's not a one size fits all solution. I think prescribed burn associations are the solutions being found by individuals working with other individuals and with other agencies and organizations in their local area. And it just really takes a spark plug in that local area to get it started. And then obviously there are constraints though here on the coast, I would say, very much in terms of when you're able to burn. If you've got 80% humidity, it's going to be really challenging to have a high consumption rate. But then if it's dry and there's an east wind event, you don't want to be conducting a prescribed burn during that time period either. Hope that answers your question. Happy to talk afterwards as well.
In regards to the associations, if a community had one of those in place, are red cards still needed by folks in that association? Do you have to work with people with red cards, or what is that?
No, usually the prescribed burn association would have some standard operating procedures in terms of like waivers. So basically the landowner on whose property you're burning is assuming the liability or risk. Red cards are not required, whereas on agency burns, the red cards are certainly required. Having a red card certainly is going to give you knowledge of fuels and fire behavior. But basically, the key is you're burning with other landowners. You don't necessarily have those qualifications that federal or state agency might have.
We have the relationship to land as being a local, which is.
Yes, that's really important. Like in Douglas County, there are ranchers who have, been burning for generations. And so, it's really trying to put fire back in the hands of people on the landscape. And so for a long time, prescribed fire has been pretty centered on agencies and National Wildland Coordinating Group, National Wildfire Coordinating Group, and NCGG. But now, it's becoming a little bit more dispersed. I think though that the Certified Burn Manager program that Oregon Department of Forestry has established, and they are the executives of, Oregon State University is a education service provider for the Certified Burn Manager program. But that provides some safeguards for people who have that Certified Burn Manager certification are somewhat shielded from liability in the case of an escape, as long as they're adhering to that burn plan. So there's definitely ways in which Oregon is moving in the right direction to get more prescribed fire on the ground. But yeah, the relationship, I think, with those private landowners is often, in conjunction and with the support of many others, like in the Rogue Valley, that prescribed burn association, kind of the symbiotic relationship with Okay, so Oregon Department of Forestry as well as rural fire protection districts are sending, engines to support a prescribed fire on private lands. And then those private landowners who are members of the Prescribed Burn Association are also ending up as volunteer firefighters with those rural fire protection districts. So I think there's a good relationship there.
Yeah, I was curious, you guys do just grassland burns or you do the forest? And if you do, what's your main purpose when you get into undergrowth?
Was that question specific to the Prescribed Burn Association?
No.
Okay.
The agency. Yeah, anyway.
Okay.
How do you get into the undergrowth? I understand the grassland,
Sure.
there's habitat everywhere too. I was just curious, can you do that? 'Cause
Absolutely. Yeah, so the general thought being, I think it's ground into me a little bit to the hazardous fuels reduction side, because that's been the main focus, even though there are wildlife and ecological benefits. But the thought being that you can put fire underneath the canopy at a time of year choosing when the conditions are right. And so you can reduce fuels and then poke small holes in the canopy and open up the conditions for wildlife. And then when and if a larger wildfire comes through, you've already reduced that fuel under controlled circumstances, and it will, in theory, have less of an impact.
yeah, and that, it really does make a lot of sense to do that.
Mhm.
But also, the argument of that undergrowth keeps the ground sort of cool and moist, so it doesn't dry out so quick, and the trees get more water during the drought seasons. So what's the fine line there?
I can't, I guess I would think it'd be a trade-off, because yes, you're keeping the ground cooler, but then that undergrowth is also consuming water, right? So you're in turn limiting the water that can get to the big trees. So I don't have a good answer, but that's my perspective on it.
Yeah. That's you study.
Mhm.
Yeah. The sage slide doesn't want. Probably need to work on it.
Yeah.
What's the?
Wouldn't a fire ecologist be involved in this kind of decision?
Yes,
You don't have that on this.
we do.
I just want to say, I have I don't have a ton of fire experience, but I did have the privilege to participate in a controlled fire in Florida. That was burning for pileated woodpecker, or not pileated woodpecker, what woodpecker was it?
Red coffee.
Yes, thank you. Red-cockaded woodpecker habitat. So they need kind of open understory forests, these specific trees. And so we were burning palmetto and other shrubs that had become really thick underneath the understory in Florida. Florida, the Southeast in general, there's a lot of burning, and a lot of it is in forests to thin out understory for wildlife habitat and benefit. So as I think both speakers mentioned, this whole concept of burning so that when you do have a wildfire, it's not as bad is really the situation where we want to be in. And I think the fire community for a very long time has been saying we need to burn more, we need to burn more, we need to burn more. And it's still not happening. So recently, this training I'm talking about, I went to was to become an agency administrator, which allows you as a federal employee to be basically the person that says, yep, fire crew, you can go ahead and burn on this federal land today. And so understanding the liability of that, understanding, why we need to burn, understanding historical fire regimes and the benefit and the real problem with putting out fires all the time, or for the hundreds of years that we've been doing that. And it was just really enlightening, but it does make so much sense. If you have more frequent fire on the environment, the fires that do happen, lightning strikes and other fires that naturally occur aren't gonna be as severe. And with climate change, increasing temperatures, increasing dryness in a lot of locations, invasive plants and things like, invasive insects that are drying out the forest even more. You just have this setup for these horrendous events. And so people are afraid of it for good reason, but we've kind of brought ourselves to this situation.
I'll just follow up and say, I would say that it really depends on what specific ecoregion we're talking about. I think, understory burning in Eastern Oregon and ponderosa pine, that's a lot different than forest of Western Oregon. The US Forest Service is the West Side Fire Initiative, and we're only now really beginning to arguably Western Oregon and the Coast Range of Oregon is where our fire science knowledge needs to have the most development. I think that oftentimes when we talk about the Coast Range, we talk about large stand replacing fires like the Tillamook burn or the Nestucca burn. And those are important, but I think it's also important to recognize the low and medium severity fires that have occurred in this landscape under moderate conditions, moderate weather conditions. And so, there's a lot we don't know about understory burning in this environment. But I would say it is very, very different ecosystem here in Western Oregon and the Coast Range compared to Eastern Oregon or the US Southeast. With Oregon State University Extension Fire Program, we do have a Not All Flames the Same. We're creating a publication that'll have illustrations showing historic vegetation and fire versus modern day vegetation and fire. It's still going through the peer review process, but we're hoping that, that will contribute to public's understanding of fire across the different ecoregions of the state of Oregon.
So we have one question from Zoom, and then I think we'll wrap it up. Doug Cooper is wondering, what are we trying to solve? What would have happened to the landscape habitat through present if no one had intervened or managed the land at all?
Do you want to take that one, David?
It would be forest. But that would assume that there were no indigenous people either. So there, it's sort of a false. It's hard to answer that question. If all people went extinct right now, it wouldn't all turn to forest though. Because you have to think about, there are like these natural processes, right? We have landslides, we have actual native, natural wildfires. So there are other things that would create natural openings. And you can probably talk to this more, but so it was a combination of cultural burning and natural events that would have made the series of openings for prairie, for Oregon silverspot butterfly. And those places wouldn't always have been the same place, right? We're trying to keep Nestucca open, but what would have happened naturally or with a combination of natural effects and cultural burning is you would have had a meadow here, and then it would have been over here, and then it would have been over here, and it would have been close enough in proximity that you could have had butterflies flourishing along the whole coast. The habitat isn't static, it's changing over time. So in the absence of humans, I suppose, forest. Go ahead. Add more to that, David.
I would just add that I can't cite the research specifically because I just read about synthesis research, but that anthropogenic or human use of fire on the landscape can be correlated with increased biodiversity in habitats. So up until a few hundred years ago, that was the case, that humans were improving the biodiversity of the habitats. So I think it's the paradigm shift that causes the question and not human influence.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all. Don't forget to fill your evaluations out. There's just some questions, you can be really brief, but with OSU Extension, they're always. I'm an assistant professor of practice and a regional fire specialist, so I need to improve my teaching. I can supervise an undergraduate intern or serve on a graduate committee, but day to day, I am giving presentations to watershed councils, to soil and water conservation districts and other partners. So your feedback will help me hopefully become a better instructor. I appreciate your time and effort on that. And let us know, any of the speakers, if you have questions. I'll stick around for a few minutes and happy to take any questions. And also, please, I brought a bunch of copies of our prescribed fire basics. So please grab anything on that back table. Like I said, it's a series of 12, and I have 11 of those documents on the back of the table. Thanks.
Wait, yes.
Oh, good, okay.
So thank you to the speakers and thank you for everyone coming. Board meeting, admin board meeting didn't happen today and we are gonna cancel our major board meeting, so, thank you.
So go home.
Also, the January community meeting is canceled, so don't show up.